là, oui.
Ouais, mais
Hein, parce qu'on en fait,
qu'est-ce qu'on en
comment le
fait?
faire.
Bah oui, tu m'étonnes.
Et
Avec quelle
donc,
volonté
tous ces
politique?
projets avec les Africains, le problème, c'est de pérenniser.
Bah oui,
Vous créez l'idée, vous faites croire, et non, et ensuite,
complètement.
On va bientôt commencer.
Super, j'attendais juste que les personnes rentrent.
Fais un petit signe.
Vous me faites un signe? Ça va. Parfait, merci. Il y a des places devant, hein. Il y a des places devant. Là. Et ça va arriver. On va commencer, vous pouvez laisser rentrer, je pense.
Shall we start?
Bonjour, bonjour à tous.
Hello, everybody.
Prenez place.
Please take a seat. There are some free seats on the side. Thank you all to be here, very numerous, like every year, to attend the Normandy Forum for Peace and to assist to this debate that takes place traditionally in Africa. This year, the title is Quel chemin prend l'Afrique? What about the future of Africa? Because even though Africa today is a continent that is not always on the news all the time like during the previous years, in 2023, Africa was quite absent from the news, but still many events take place and reconfigurations that concern us, all of us, and very much linked to what is going on everywhere in the world. And also very much anchored or in the local realities with very specific contexts, and we can debate about it. And contrarily to an image widely known, and the players, international players, play a very significant role, but it's not them who determine the balances, who determine the reconfigurations and the relations of power that exist. I think that personally we have to get out of the idea of Africa being toys in the hands of the international players. The dynamics are much more subtle, and this debate will be about this situation with our speakers who accepted to join us. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm fine. So I have the following speakers. First of all, Abdelak Bassou, who is a researcher at the Policy Center for the New South, which is a think tank, more and more influent internationally. It's a Moroccan think tank producing many works, very active, very dynamic. And Abdelak is going to talk to us about the reconfiguration of relations between Maghreb, Algeria, and Morocco, and the South countries and the Sahel countries in particular. The second speaker, his name is Medane Tadesse, who is a researcher at the Institute of the Mondes Africains, African Worlds, and also part of the think tank I am in charge of, the African Security Sector Network. He is Ethiopian and is a great expert in the political and security dynamics in the Horn of Africa. And he's going to talk to us today about interactions between this horn, African horn, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, namely, and the Middle East powers. And last but not least, Ivan Guishawa, who is a researcher, independent researcher, one of the most significant experts on Sahel issues. He worked a lot on them, he wrote a lot, he spoke a lot on them in the media over the last few years, but he will share with us a wider perspective by talking to us about the issues, concerns of democracy in this continent, and the pushing forward of more authoritarian regimes nowadays, and how the African public opinions react facing these evolutions. So to start with, I don't know if you have already attended to other debates about geography, but if it's not the case, the whole Normandy team for peace would like to put forward the index that has been created both by the research department of the European Parliament and by the Institute for Economics and Peace in partnership with the Normandy region. And this index is a tool, assessment tool, about the level of conflicts in 136 countries in the world. So this Normandy index takes into account 11 levels of threats as follows: climate change, cybersecurity, democratic processes, economical crises, energy security, fragile states, homicides, disinformation, terrorism, violent conflicts, and massive destruction weapons. So from this index have been made notes, ranks from 0, serious threat, to 10, no risk. So not surprisingly, the 10 countries in the world where this index is the highest are Switzerland, Norway, Australia, Iceland, New Zealand, Canada, Singapore, Malaysia, South Korea, and the 27 countries of the European Union. On the contrary, those who have the lowest ranking are Mali, Iraq, South Sudan, Yemen, Somalia, Congo, RDC, Chad, Central African Republic, Afghanistan, and Syria. And if I am mentioning these countries, it's because a majority of them are situated on the African continent. As you can see here on the slide, the index for Africa of the Normandy Index for Peace is 5.5 points. 5.21. So it's in the middle of the cursor. So it means if there are a lot of countries waging war, a lot of them are still at peace. So this forum is putting forward or highlighting the countries having violence and difficulties. We must not forget that other countries are emerging countries or stable countries. So this was my introduction. Before starting the debates, we would like to show you a video, which is a capsule of a new program that is going to be launched in partnership with TV5 Monde from next week. It's called The Words of Peace. We also worked with them, with Normandy, to reflect on it, but it's mainly TV5 Monde and the International Organization of Francophonie for the capsules. Capsules was already shown yesterday, broadcast yesterday, because Africa, apart from we said and what we are going to discuss about rivalries and reconfigurations, has to face transnational problems common to all of the states of the African continent. The capsule broadcast yesterday was about floodings impacting a lot of African countries, also the rest of the world. But so yesterday you saw the capsule about flooding, and this capsule is about refugees.
Plus de 30 millions d'Africains ont dû fuir.
More than 30 million of Africans had to flee their house or shelters. Are all of them refugees?
Ces femmes burkinabées sont réfugiées au Mali.
Burkinabe women are refugees in Mali because the situation in Burkina made them flee. She's talking about armed military people killing members of her family, so they had to flee to another village, and then they went to Mopti. This human drama is not alone. Africa is a stage of a lot of movements of immigrations fleeing violence or global warming.
Deux termes reviennent souvent.
Two keywords,
Réfugiés
refugees and displaced. In both cases, it's a movement of population due to a crisis, but the legal status has nothing, is different. The first thing to know, the status of refugees defined and protected by the international law. A refugee is out of his original country because he fears persecution, conflicts, violence, or other circumstances demanding an international protection. On the other hand, internal displaced people will not benefit from any international protection. And they had to flee, even though they had to flee, to avoid conflicts, violence, wars, or violation of human rights or natural catastrophes, but they didn't cross the border of another state. So, since when refugees can benefit from a protection? It was in 1951 was adopted the Relative Convention for Refugees. And Africa, adopted another convention in 1969 and then confirmed by the Convention of Kampala in 2009 about displaced people. Where are the highest number of refugees in Africa? Nowadays, Sudan and South Sudan, and also in RDC, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Somalia.
Burkina Faso subit
Burkina Faso,
une véritable crise de déplacement avec plus de 2 millions de
with more than 2 million people displaced, and also Niger, Chad. Who are these refugees and displaced people? Millions of them on the continent of Africa. 20% are men, 33% women, and half of them children, and their living conditions are very precarious. 85% are living in an overpopulation situation. Of course, there are official welcoming and hosting centers, very often already welcomed by very vulnerable communities. Even though conflicts can start concerning the exploitation of agriculture or land.
Alors, comment protéger ces
So how can we protect these refugees and displaced people? First, it's the responsibility of the states. It's up to the states to guarantee the protection of these people, and the main provision of the 1951 Convention is saying this: no forced return. No, they must not be expelled or sent back to their original countries if their freedom is in danger due to different factors. On the other hand, the protection of displaced people depends primarily on their own state, but this state refuses often to guarantee it. This is why other players are mobilized, like the UNHCR from the United Nations, the warrant of the Convention of 1951. They coordinate the international collaboration with different governments, and is also in charge of the displaced people. And human NGOs like Red Cross and other NGOs like Doctors Without Borders and other African organizations play a role. Very often, they are subcontracting to other NGOs who cannot have access due to security reasons or knowledge of the territory, because it's impossible nowadays to have a real impact on the beneficiary populations. I hope I gave you some keys of understanding about the situation of refugees and displaced people in Africa, but if you need more information, go to the website of TV5 Monde.
Voilà, donc
So this is it.
donc c'est un nouveau programme qui se veut très
It's a new program, very pedagogical. Everything that is presented in this video can be found on the website of the TV5 Monde. with links to all the resources, conventions, original texts, comments, analysis that have been produced by researchers and other articles, press articles, recent press articles on this issue. Now I'm going to give the floor to Abdelak Bassou to talk to us about the reconfiguration of relations between Maghreb and Sahel countries. Thank you, my dear friend. Hello, everybody.
Alors, avec le tableau de pays, vous...
If you look, if I look at the table of the different countries, you give me an introduction about the Maghreb countries. You're talking about 55 countries in Africa. The last one that you mentioned, the Sahrawi Arab Democratic country. I don't know why it was added, and there is an alphabetical order, and there is an additional country with an asterisk. I don't know what it means. There are 54 countries in the United Nations, not 55. So this is introducing a problem. If this country exists, where is it? What is its capital? It doesn't come from the outspace. But I'm telling this for the forum. Is it talking to the United Nations, or I don't know? It's a question. There are 54 countries in Africa, not 55. If there is a 55th country, you have to tell me where is it? If it is part of the Algerian province, it is within the Algerian territory. This being said, we're talking about Maghreb, and we're going to talk about Sahel. Institutionally speaking, we are talking about a structure called Union of the Arab Maghreb, created in 1989 in Marrakesh. And since 2014, we are talking about 5 Sahel countries under the name of G5 Sahel. The first structure, the Union of the Arabic Maghreb, is in a deep coma. The body is existing, but the body is not alive. Nothing happens. General Secretary has been appointed, but in fact this structure does not exist. If you talk about Maghreb, you talk about a geographical territory, space, the same area, same region, but the Union of the Arabic Maghreb, considered as to be one of the regional economical community in Africa, does not exist. And I will come back to this later on. And when we talk about the G5 Sahel, we should talk about the former or the dead G5 Sahel, because when you look at what happened in Burkina, in Niger, and so on, the problems between the different problems, the G5 Sahel, the state that helped, that pushed, who created, it's France. And since then, the relationships between France and these countries do not longer don't exist anymore. So we were having a hope. We were having the hope of seeing this geographical and economical region, which are Maghreb and Sahel, but unfortunately, many events show that, demonstrate that these entities do no longer exist. So when we want to talk about this region, we will be talking about relationships between states instead of relations between institutions of integration or structures of integration. So, if we can go back to this issue, first of all, in Maghreb, when we talk about the question between Morocco and Algeria,
Rien ne va entre ces deux pays.
Nothing.
Même plus de relations diplomatiques.
We don't even have any more diplomatic relations. The borders are closed. We have nothing else, nothing more, no more relationships. But both countries are fully aware that, and maybe the three other countries in Maghreb, they are fully aware that they don't have any future within this structure.
Je parle beaucoup plus du Maroc.
I'm talking much more about Morocco because I know well Morocco. In Morocco, for instance, we are more taking into consideration our Atlantic dimension and less our Maghrebic dimension, because the position of Morocco, as you can see on the map, we are part of a Mediterranean space, but we are part of Africa because it's our continent. But on the east side, on the east side, it's the Arabic world, if you want to call it the Arabic world. So the route to this Arabic world, we have to jump over Algeria. On the eastern part, so bad relations. So we are much more interested in our Atlantic dimension. So last year, in November 2023, Her Majesty the King launched an initiative called Atlantic Africa. In other words, it was a research seeking for cooperation or integration to some extent of 23 countries which are on the Atlantic coast, from South Africa to Morocco, including Western Africa, Guinea Gulf, and so on. Another initiative was launched by Morocco in that direction. And the fact to remove or extract the Sahel countries, and we are talking to the countries of a specific charter, AES, Alliance of the States of Sahel. And they became recently the Confederation of the Sahel States. I will come back to this later on. So Morocco understands that we have to help these countries because they don't have access to the Atlantic Ocean, and it will have an impact on their economy, evolution, development, and so on. So we have countries and instances don't understand why Morocco wants to open up these countries led by military governments. Last year, I had to write with Ramayat to the Atlantic Council in the States on these countries and on this initiative to open them up. And the Americans accepted. And we cannot say we are helping countries that are led by military powers. As the writer of the article, I had to explain to American people that the first thing is that the Moroccan constitution, when they speak about Africa and Sahel, they talk about solidarity and cooperation relations with the African people, not with a regime, not cooperation with the regimes. And the second thing, and I am talking to all the powers, when you sanction a regime, it's not the president or the government of the regime who will suffer, it's the population who will suffer. So if we sanction Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and so on, and maybe somehow Chad also, because of coups, military coups, it's not the generals and colonels who will be impacted, but the population. So the philosophy in Morocco is to have these solidarity and cooperation relations with these people and have initiatives with these people, whatever their origin. We are obliged to do like this, to be able to help them. And maybe with this
on peut changer
action,
les choses de
we could
l'intérieur.
change things
Parler, c'est
internally.
même s'il y a des putschistes,
Talk.
on leur parle.
Even if they are
On
putsch
leur explique,
people, we
il y a
can
un
talk to
espoir
them,
que
explain them there is hope.
se faire, c'est donc dans ce sens-là
So
que
this
le
is
Maroc
the
a pris
approach
cette
of
initiative.
Morocco. This is why Morocco took this initiative.
Et Algérie,
Sahel and Algeria,
aujourd'hui, entre le Mali et l'Algérie,
nowadays
ça ne marche
between Mali and
absolument
Algeria,
pas.
it doesn't
Ça
work
arrive à
at
des
all.
tensions,
It's very tense. The relations are
je
very
crois que même
tense.
au niveau des
And
relations
I
diplomatiques,
even
ça commence à ne
think
plus
that
marcher.
the diplomatic relations
L'Algérie,
are
par
in a
contre,
bad
est en train
situation.
d'essayer de reprendre
On the
ses
other hand,
relations
Algeria
avec le Niger
is
et
trying to
partenaires.
resume their
Sumatra va
relations
retravailler
with
le Niger.
Niger. And I think Sumatra is
Tout ça
going
pour vous
to
dire
work
que
again
les
in
pays du
Niger.
Maghreb sont
All
en
this
train
to
de
tell you
chercher
that the
ailleurs.
Maghreb countries are
C'est-à-dire de
looking
chercher de quelle
elsewhere
manière rétablir leur
how they can
relation
reestablish
ailleurs
their relations
qu'au Maghreb.
elsewhere
La
apart
Libye
from
est
Maghreb.
occupée
Libya
avec ce qu'elle a.
is occupied,
Déjà, à l'intérieur
is
de
busy
Libye, tout le monde
with
connaît
what
le-
they have to do, internally, the internal situation.
déstabilisée par le
It
printemps
was
arabe
much
et depuis,
destabilized
elle n'arrive
by
plus à
the
se reprendre.
Arabic
La
Spring.
Tunisie aussi, depuis le printemps
Tunisia
arabe, est en train
also,
de se
seeing the
rechercher
Arabic
donc,
Spring, they are facing
de
problems
reste le
and
cinquième
they have to
pays du
recover.
Maghreb, qui est
And the
la
fifth
Mauritanie.
country of Maghreb is
La
Mauritania.
Mauritanie, c'est un pays stable,
And it's a stable
mais
country,
c'est un pays qui
but
essaie de
this
jongler
country is
entre le
trying
Maroc et
to
l'Algérie.
to
Ils ne veulent
play
contenter
between
personne.
Morocco and Algeria.
Ce
They
sont
don't
ces
want
deux
to
voisins.
be unpleasant with any of
Dans la
them.
mitigation,
These are two neighbors. They are
il y a un mot
in
que les
mitigation.
Italiens aiment beaucoup,
There is an
neutralité positive.
an Italian word that
ça veut dire
Italians
quelque
like
chose, je ne
very
sais pas.
much.
De
They
toute
like
façon,
very
c'est
much
une
its
politique
positive
qu'ils ont,
neutrality. I don't know what it means, but this is what they
Par exemple,
use.
pour le projet de désenclavement
So
du
this
Sahel, on doit
project
passer par
of
eux et
opening up
ils nous disent
Sahel,
oui, nous
we
sommes
have
là,
to go
et tout,
through them.
mais
They say yes.
ils se font
So, but they are very discreet.
discrets. Du côté du Sahel,
As far as Sahel is concerned, now we have the constitution between three Sahel countries, what we call AES, that is called now the Confederation of the Sahel States. Well, their first concern is with Western Africa, because as a confederation now, they announced that they are getting out from the economical community of Western Africa.
pose un problème.
And this is a problem for the CDAO.
On a maintenant des pays qui pensent peut-être rejoindre cette alliance. Des pays de l'Afrique.
So maybe we have to talk about the African
Bénin,
countries.
La Guinée
Benin,
sont déjà
Guinea
sur ce...
are
Ils
already
peuvent franchir le pas.
on this path, or ready
Le Tchad
to do it.
peut franchir
Chad
le pas.
could do it also.
Et donc, ils posent un peu ce
So,
problème en Afrique de l'Ouest.
so we have
Et
this
d'ailleurs,
problem
même
in Western
la
Africa.
collaboration du Maroc avec ces
And the
gens-là,
collaboration of
l'Afrique de
Morocco
l'Ouest,
with these
de l'Ouest,
people,
essaie
with
de dire au Maroc
Western
que
Africa, Western Africa
ne
is
les
trying to
encourage
say
pas
to Morocco, do not encourage them.
essayer de sortir, si l'on veut. Donc, alors l'autre question
So the other
dont on ne parle pas,
question
c'est que les
that we
relations
do not
entre le
talk
Sahel
about, the
et-
relations between Sahel and, what about time? Okay.
entre le Sahel et le Maghreb,
Between Sahel and
c'est
Maghreb,
que dans cette
is
région,
that in this region,
les relations étaient avec une puissance européenne,
relations
soit au Maghreb,
existed with European power,
depuis
France, both for Sahel
le départ au
and
Sahel,
Morocco. Since the coup in Sahel,
l'Algérie qui était à la fois
Algeria
en
was
négociation avec la
at the
France,
same
mais
time
surtout
having
attaquée
relations
en
with
ce qui
France
concerne
and
l'achat
also
d'armements à la Russie.
buying weapons from Russia.
Depuis ce qui s'est passé
So
dans
since
le
what
Sahel,
happened in
on
Sahel,
assiste à l'arrivée des Russes.
the Russians are coming over.
L'arrivée des Russes
And the
Compli-
arrival of Russian people
pour les
is
pays du Maghreb
making
qui
the situation more
traditionnellement
complicated for the
sont,
Maghreb
plutôt
countries
des alliés de
who
l'Occident.
have been allies of
Les pays
Occident,
sahéliens,
of
dont
Western
trois déjà
countries
sont-
traditionally.
s'attachent
So
de plus en
three
plus,
Sahel countries
à
now
la Russie, d'autres
are
sont
more
en train
and more
d'arriver, les
close to
relations
Russia.
du Tchad avec la Russie
Others
sont en train de se
are
fortifier.
getting closer
Donc
to
cela
Russia. So this is complicating the relationship
entre des pays maghrébins,
between the
Maroc,
Maghreb
Mauritanie,
countries,
Tunisie, qui ont toujours
Morocco,
un peu cette
Tunisia,
relation,
Mauritania, and so on,
forte
who have
avec
always
l'Europe
had
et la France,
strong
entre
relationships with
l'Algérie
France
d'une
and
part
Europe,
et
between
ces pays du
Algeria on the
Sahel
one hand and the
qui
Sahel countries,
commencent à
who start
diriger un peu
to
le cap vers la Russie,
direct
même si c'est encore
they
plus
look
compliqué,
towards Russia, even though it's quite
Le Mali.
complicated, because Mali,
soutenu par les Russes,
supported by the Russians,
combat les rebelles au
is
nord,
fighting against the
sont
rebels
soutenus par
in the
l'Algérie.
north, supported by Algeria.
Ça crée même des problèmes,
So it is
ça devient nébuleux.
creating a very cloudy or
Question.
situation, concern.
Ça, c'est la relation avec l'Europe. Il me reste
This is the relation with Europe.
c'est que cette région du Sahel est connue
And that
un peu pour
Sahelian region
ce qu'on appelle cette violence extrémiste,
is also famous for its extremist violence.
mais qui ne se classe pas au niveau
But
du terrorisme international. tel
It's
qu'on
not
le connaît,
classified, or it's not
connu,
part
qu'on
of
le connaît.
international terrorism
On
that
parle beaucoup
one
de
has
Al-Qaïda
known.
là-bas, on parle beaucoup de Daesh,
One
mais
talks
ces
of
gens du
Daesh or
Sahel
Al-Qaïda
n'ont
there,
jamais fait
but
un
people
attentat
in the
ailleurs
Sahel have
que
never
chez eux.
have never made an attack, a terrorist attack outside of the
Ce
Sahel.
qu'on pense actuellement,
And
c'est
so the general opinion
dans ces
today
pays-là, il y a
is that
beaucoup
within
de
the
gens qui sont
states
musulmans.
there are a lot of Muslim people.
Sur le Maghreb, il y a beaucoup de gens qui sont
In
arabes et musulmans. Et on
in
se
the Maghreb, there are a lot of people who are both Arabs and Muslims, and one wonders whether the events taking place in the Middle East are not being transposed to that area that has already lost its stability and that is undergoing a lot of violence today. So I'll stop here
Merci beaucoup,
for now. Thank you so much, Abdelak.
Je pense que ça fera
And I do think that it will be part of the questions that we can discuss later. And the opening up that you mentioned regarding the Sahel, is there an exportation of what's happening in the Middle East? I'm not sure personally, but it'll be interesting to talk about it and discuss it. Medani,
All
if you can speak up because of the
Yes,
rain.
yeah, the rain, yeah. Well, okay. I'm going to talk about the Horn's international system, and also African international system, because the Horn is different for many reasons. It's where national, regional, continental, and international violence is taking place. So you have the chemistry of all these types of violence at different levels. And this is happening when the global environment is drastically shifting. So how do we assess this? One, I was hearing a remark now in the early morning at the plenary, which was presented as a framework of the Normandy Declaration about nuclear weapons, about global threats, climate, and the like. But I think I might add one thing as a global Normandy Declaration, that is the non-repetition of genocide. Because genocide is happening in most of the violent wars in Africa, mainly in the Horn of Africa. Almost 1 million people killed in 2 years' war in Tigray, Ethiopia. Tens of thousands are being killed in Sudan. And the world is not even talking about it. So why is that when some wars are happening, like for instance, Ukraine, maybe we have 20,000, I'm not discounting, or Gaza, it seems that the skies and the world is falling down, while millions and hundreds of thousands are killed in Africa, nobody is talking about it. I think this shows global power relations. This really shows global power relations. Some issues are more important than others. Some few lives are more important than millions of lives. Now, probably this seems almost meaningless, except that it is not totally meaningless, because there is an explanation. Now, when we talk about the Horn is different. Probably in terms of international relations, African international relations, the Horn is the top. Largest wars in Africa. Maybe they are close to European wars, by the way. Largest humanitarian crisis in the world. The largest wars are not in Europe or in the Middle East, they are in Africa. Largest humanitarian crisis. The Horn is the theater for the war on terror, the largest theater for the war on terror. The Horn is the theater for violent competition for supply chains as it related to capitalism, new supply chain capitalism. You know what I mean when I say that. There is violent competition in the Horn of Africa for control of supply chains, for control of corridors, for control of ports, for control of gold, for control of livestock smuggling. This is what is happening in the Horn of Africa. And it shows the collapsing global order. And the Horn is also different for other reasons. Even the Horn is different from other African regions. It's the only region where state borders are not respected. It's the only sub-region that the relevance of borders, state borders, is in question. This is becoming a global phenomenon, I'm afraid. It's becoming a phenomenon in the Sahel. It's becoming a phenomenon even in the Middle East. Borders will be questioned and redrawn. And we are seeing it happening in the Horn of Africa. And it happens everywhere with the collapse and shattering of the global order, with the emergence of multipolarity, with a chaotic global order we are witnessing in the Horn of Africa. The Horn of Africa is the theater for computing nation-building projects, like what happened in Europe 100 years back. That's why you see large-scale wars in the Horn of Africa. That's why you see the involvement of different countries in national wars, whether it's in Sudan, in Ethiopia, or in Somalia. The Horn of Africa is also different because it is the largest theater for the intervention and violence of new powers, middle powers. There might be some cases in the Sahel, or maybe in the DRC, maybe in the Middle East. But if you see the volume, if you see the money involved, if you see the level of violence, no region compares the Horn. You see the Turkish in Somalia, the Emirates in Somalia, the Qataris in Somalia. They buy elections, by the way, in Somalia. Who pays more determines who becomes president in Somalia now. Who pays more from the Middle East? You have parliamentarians bought by Middle East money electing presidents. You have wars and drones involved in creating havoc, tens of thousands being killed. That's why I say the Horn is different. It's a region where we see the chaotic global environment emerging and shaping us. What we see in Ethiopia, what we see in Sudan now, what we see in Somalia now, what we see in the Red Sea is emblematic of what will happen. The collapse of the global world order. Even the paralysis of the UN is happening under our eyes in the Horn of Africa. There has been 12 attempts for the UN Security Council to vote in one of the conflicts in the Horn of Africa. All of them failed or either blocked. Why they were blocked? Some African countries ganged up with China and Russia, blocked it. You see the paralysis at the UN level by what is happening in the Horn of Africa. This is new. The level, we have never seen like this. Sudan doesn't have a government now. You have the emergence of militias controlling not only the political economy of the country, but also the monopoly of violence of the state. The Sudanese state had militias in the past. Now the militias will have a state. This is what I call as militia capitalism recently. It's emerging. Militias controlling borders, paradoxically with the help of the Europeans. I was alleging years back that the RSF, the militia, which came from the Janjaweed, involved in the genocide in Western Darfur, the RSF was supported by the European Union. Why? Because of migration policy. Why migration policy? Well, it's European politics. Europe dropping its normative actorness. We are hearing now new talking lines. Europe has shared interests. What does that mean? They are not saying anymore we have shared values. Well, they are saying shared interests. They are totally different. Because of migration policy, the European Union supported a militia that has been involved in genocidal war, legitimizing it, empowering it. Now we see what's happening in Sudan. With those funding, they controlled the smuggling routes to Libya, to Chad, and now, after the Europeans, the Emirates supports them. What do they want? They want lawless zones of resource extraction. So what happened after 2017? I think that's my landmark with the changing of the global environment. The US retreated from the Red Sea and the Middle East, subcontracting to its allies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE. Then what happened? Saudi Arabia and the UAE began to intervene in the Horn of Africa. Using the vacuum. What was the impact of this? I might put it this way. The new powers in the Middle East became too independent from the US or the West. They began to pursue an independent foreign policy and use it against Western democracy. This is what is happening. Former allies of the West or the US becoming autonomous to project military power, financial power, diplomatic muscle, and to work against Western democracy. So on the one hand, they are illiberal, but they use neoliberal violence, deregulation. That's why transitions to peace or transitions to democracy in the Horn become ultimately transitions to war. Ethiopia is one example. Prime Minister Abiy came to power. It was considered as a transition to democracy. He was provided with a Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel Peace Prize was given for a war pact, not for peace. And the transition led to war. We had a Sudanese transition, which was considered as, mass protest, youth movement. Fantastic. They toppled al-Bashir. It was considered as a transition to democracy. It became a transition to war. Let's ask why. Why are transitions to democracy turning to be transitions to war in the Horn of Africa? And partly the reason is that regional powers from the Middle East are using collective violence to control ports, supply chains, livestock trade in a lawless zone of extraction. This is very critical. In order to do that, they have to reproduce themselves. They have to create authoritarian regimes. They have to support strong men. They have to weaken democracy. They have to weaken civil society. They don't need normal governments that can regulate their intervention economically, diplomatically. That's why you have rogue actors, including militias, controlling the foreign policy of governments. So the Horn is a testimony of what is happening globally, this chaotic transition to multipolarity. It's not peaceful, and it's not smooth. I think I have to stop it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Medani, for this very brilliant demonstration, which is opening lots of debates. And I think that your conclusion is directly linked to what Yvan will address in his own presentation.
Merci Magali.
Yvan, c'est à toi.
Merci beaucoup de me donner la parole.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor. Thank you to the previous speakers who have eased the way for me. But the conclusion I will get to will echo what's been said. So if I don't have enough time, you can just remember what Medani said. In a way, we have the same conclusion, and I certainly agree with what he's just said. And one has to mention one thing. In our French-speaking space, we tend to focus on the Sahel region because there was a French military intervention not so long ago there. And if you're not interested in the Sahel, you look at other French-speaking countries, and we tend to forget the Horn of Africa. But the most serious problems on the African continent are certainly take place in the Horn of Africa and have a scope, a size that is really shocking, and that is certainly very much greater than the attention that it deserves. But what I'd like to talk about is democratic fatigue, it's a concept that was coined some years ago by political experts, and said that who saw that on the African continent, there's maybe less hopes or aspirations for democracy. Maybe you can see that through polls, where people say that they believe less and less into democratic systems to solve their problems. Another way to see that, to see the signs of that democratic fatigue, is to notice that authoritarian regimes are more and more numerous, either because the democratic regime is being replaced by a military regime, or because the Democrats, or those who are supposed to be democratic, tend to turn or to take hold of that system and use it for their own power. And there is also a political reconfiguration with this. A lot of countries that have shown the sign of distance from democracy in terms of their international relations have moved away from partners or Western partners, and who have moved towards other international partners like Russia, China, Turkey, or Iran. So I'm talking in a general way, but I'll be mostly referring to Sahel because I know Sahel very quite well. But this can be said about the rest of the continent, and I don't pretend to be an expert on the whole continent. But if you've got specific questions on the Sahel in the Q&A session, I'd be delighted to answer. Even though my colleagues here really know the Sahel very well too.
Alors le Sahel a ceci de particulier
There's something specific in the Sahel is that it has shifted lately towards military regimes. In a few years, we've had coups in Mali,
au Burkina Faso,
in Burkina Faso twice,
puis au Niger,
in the Niger, where there has been 2 coups. One that was a real coup, and there was the second there was a coup within the coup in May 2021. So these 3 countries in 4 years have had 5 military coups.
Et ces coups d'État ont été
These coups were followed by a sovereign aspiration, saying that they wanted to show that they were sovereign. They wanted to move away from Western influence, but it was a bit paradoxical because they wanted to be sovereign, but they turned to non-Western partners. Another way that these coups took place was that there was a dictatorial governance, and it's interesting to see how the vocabulary has changed. Straight after a coup, when you think that the military are ready to give the power back to civilians, you talk about a transition regime, but then you realize that it's not the case, so you move from transition, which is authoritarianism, and then in the case of the Sahel in particular, I think we need to call things by their name.
Forte tendance dictatoriale.
There are dictatorial states, more in the Burkina than its 2 neighbors.
Ce label.
And the regime Burkina certainly deserves the label of dictatorship.
International dorénavant axé vers l'est.
So now there's more Eastern orientation on national level towards Iran, Turkey, Russia, China. But what's interesting is to see the relationships or the relations between these countries with their neighbors. There's been a break with ECOWAS from Burkina, Mali, and the Niger, and beyond these multilateral tensions, also bilateral tensions between Benin and Niger, between the Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina, between Mali and Algeria. So we see a whole region that is losing its diplomatic bearings, if you like, and so there's a shift certainly there. There's been a lot of things written on this authoritarian shift, and one explanation that tends to dominate, that you will see with political experts or in think tank reports. There's the International Crisis Book, for instance, a report from a big American think tank that really highlights the failure of democracies as an explanation or main explanation of that shift towards military regimes.
Et je trouve, et c'est un petit peu l'enjeu de ma contribution dans ce
but I find that this explanation is a bit limited, if you like. Because yes, you could say that democratic regimes that were overthrown by these military regimes did not offer a satisfying democracy to populations. They couldn't see the benefits of development. They could see that the elites were corrupt,
leur pouvoir,
and that they would prolong their power by manipulating elections or by making sure that their successor remains in their orbit, if you like. So the democracy that came before these military regimes was not a satisfactory democracy, but the idea that I'd like to challenge is
entre, d'une part, le rejet
that there is something automatic between the rejection of democracy
l'arrivée au pouvoir
and the arrival to power of strong men or
autoritaire.
authoritarian regimes. But this first element that was analyzed by colleagues,
Nicolas Van der Waal vient de décéder malheureusement, mais qui a fait un travail
like Nicolas Van der Waal, who sadly passed away recently, but he worked on that democratic setback or on the African
dans les années 1990.
the African government. And when multipartyism was introduced in Africa in the 1990s,
de gouvernance démocratique,
so
et
the
que, au fil des
democratic
années,
governance processes were adopted, and year after year, democracy improved, got steadier, got to a climax, and then started falling back. But what Nicolas Van der Waal, which I think is is crucial, is that
il ne faut pas parler de recul démocratique. Il faut
we shouldn't talk about a setback, or we should talk about democratic systems that never reached a level of consolidation that would be satisfactory or sufficient.
Le problème, c'est la démocratie, et non, le problème, c'est pas la démocratie.
And the problem is not democracy,
Incomplète,
it's incomplete democracy.
s'est installée et qui a été finalement acceptée un petit peu par tout le monde, y compris par les Occidentaux.
Which settled in and which was accepted by everyone, including Westerners. And in many African countries, especially in the Sahel, there's this kind of soft
assez peu contestable, verrouillé,
democracy,
et
manipulated
ça,
democracy.
on a appelé ça démocratie, mais non, en fait, c'est pas.
It's called democracy, but it's not
Et donc, je
democracy.
pense que quand on produit ces analyses,
And I think that if you analyze the way militaries came into power in these countries, one should not consider that they are the sign of the failure of
au
democracy.
contraire, la manifestation
They are the sign
de l'échec d'une démocratie.
of the sign of a failure of a democracy that did not deserve the name of democracy.
Il y a un autre élément ou une autre idée que je voulais
There's another idea that I want you to
celle
challenge,
que les militaires sont nécessairement
which is that the military are necessarily the consequence, the automatic consequence
de cette fatigue.
of that fatigue
démocratique.
of
Et en fait, c'est pas vraiment le cas.
democratic
On a
fatigue.
tendance à
And it's
croire
not the case
ce genre
either.
de choses, peut-être
One
quand
tends
on
to
a
believe
dérivé
when
sur le
you
Sahel,
only
parce
focus on
qu'on
the
constate
Sahel,
que dans ces trois pays,
because you realize that in these
les militaires qui ont raflé la mise,
these three countries, it
et en fait,
is
si on
the military that go into
regarde
power.
ce
But
qui
if you
se
move
passe ailleurs
away
sur le
and
continent,
look at
eh
what
ben, on
happens
voit
elsewhere
que,
on the continent,
il y a de
one can
l'insatisfaction
see
face
that
au
there's
processus démocratique en place.
there's insatisfaction
de la
regarding the
fatigue
democracies
des
in
élites,
place, there's fatigue.
qui se font réélire indéfiniment.
These elites that get re-elected indefinitely and remain and keep a very unsatisfactory status quo in place for the populations, but it's not necessarily the military that that are seen by populations as those that can save those regimes and put order back into governance systems.
Le coup d'État, c'est
The coup
une manifestation
is a manifestation or a political process that is quite specific,
et la combinaison de plusieurs
which is the combination of a number of things.
et une de ces choses, c'est
And one of these
l'encodage,
things
si on pouvait
is the encoding, if you like,
du mécontentement social.
of the social discontent.
Faire appel aux militaires, c'est pas quelque chose d'absolument naturel. Et ce qui s'est passé dans le cas du Sahel,
calling
c'est
upon
pas
the
que
military is not
faut
something that's
brancher
quite natural. And what
les
happened in the
dynamiques sahéliennes,
Sahel,
ce qui se passe en dehors du
and
Sahel,
that's where we need to connect what's happening in the Sahel to what's happening outside, especially on the international level, or quite a wide way. What happened in the Sahel
le mécontentement vis-à-vis
is that the
des
discontent
démocraties
against the democratic
qui était bien réel,
elites, which was
dans la
real,
population, il a été aussi monté en épingle de
was
l'extérieur,
also highlighted from the
des campagnes
outside
sur les réseaux
by
sociaux,
campaigns on social networks,
généralement mises en œuvre par des acteurs extérieurs au Sahel,
usually implemented by exterior players, the Russians. Let's not be naive.
l'interférence russe. Faut
And
pas
we should not say that there was no Russian a Russian
ce sont les
influence.
militaires qui ont été présentés comme ceux qui allaient
And the military were
sauver
presented as those who could
pays
save
sahéliens. C'est un des éléments.
the
L'encodage
Sahelian
du
countries. So that
L'autre
encoding, if you
élément,
like, of
c'est que
discontent.
les
The
militaires,
other
finalement, au Sahel, ont toujours
element was that the military in the Sahel have
place assez
always
particulière,
had a very specific place
dans l'espace politique.
in the political
Que
space.
les élites civiles
And civilian
jamais
elites
imposé,
never
face,
imposed
aux
themselves
militaires comme des remparts
against the
infrangissables.
military
Et le troisième élément qui est
as
spécifique
real
au Sahel,
barriers.
c'est des pays en
And the
guerre
third element that's
et,
specific to
des
the Sahel,
pays en
there are
guerre,
countries at war
Souvent, les populations
And
estiment
in countries
que
in a country at war, the population often
guerre,
thinks
ce
that
sont
the most
les militaires.
able
Et
person
donc,
to
si on
lead a country at war
dézoome, va au-delà du Sahel, où on constate
is the
effectivement que ce sont,
military.
les militaires qui ont
So if we move away
la
from the Sahel,
Islamisme,
if we
il
look
peut
elsewhere
y avoir finalement
from the Sahel, we
des,
can see that
processus de
there
contestation.
might
Il y a,
be
je sais pas si vous avez
processes or
assisté à la séance
protests.
plénière où Hervé Morin
Processes,
disait
I don't know
qu'une
if
des
you
caractéristiques
listen
fondamentales
to
de
the
la
plenary session
démocratie,
where Hervé
c'est la
Morin
contestabilité
said that
du pouvoir.
one of the major aspects of democracy is that the power could be contested. So a democratic regime should hear contestation. Other countries, certain countries have listened to that, have heard protests in Kenya with the youth against the tax law, in Nigeria against police violence, and it's a reaction from the population that's quite healthy and that is nourishing democracy in these countries. So maybe that's the optimistic message that one can remember from my presentation. We don't have to have the military, including in a democratic system that is not fulfilling its role and it's not satisfying the population.
Et surtout qu'une fois qu'on a les militaires au pouvoir,
And once the military are in power, I'll try and conclude. Once you have the military in power, you're in a difficult situation. You know the old proverb say that when you have a hammer in your hand, all problems look like nails, and the military can wage war, and that's all they can do. And the people they talk to, they see, or the people in front of them, they see them as enemies and not people that can, or groups that they can, or players they can compromise with. The last question I'd like to broach is the way the West, the people in the West are a bit confused with that situation. That's where I echo what Medani was saying. The Westerners cannot bring or formulate the right solutions to solve the situations we see in the Sahel. Why? Because that kind of soft, corrupt democracy comes from the past policies of the West in the region. The fact that they wanted stabilization in conflict in conflict zones, wanted to encourage unsatisfying electoral processes and so forth. So the West cannot be heard in that region because of their past, because of the fact that they're accepting issues elsewhere in the world that are the same to those faced in the Sahel, where it's bad in the Sahel, but it's okay elsewhere. And the only way, maybe the only solution might come from civil societies in the Sahel, but also in the West. Because what I find striking in what we can observe with the weakening of democracy is that it echoes problems that we also have in our democracies. And I'll conclude there.
Merci beaucoup, Yvan.
Thank you very much, Yvan, and thank you to the three of you about these very rich enlightenments. I have a few questions in echo to your different points of view, agreements or disagreements, but I would rather first give the floor to the audience. And maybe at the end, if we have enough time, I will ask you my questions to the panelists. Any reaction, comment, any questions?
Oui, madame.
Yes.
Ouais, très bonne question. Alors, je précise toujours, moi j'aime toujours beaucoup quand on dit vous n'avez pas parlé de...
Mike, okay. Very good question. There are many things that we haven't mentioned. This is why we have a different topic.
Mais en l'occurrence, je pense que cette question peut être...
Yes, your question can be posed to Abdallah Vassou because he spoke about the other organizations who precisely, whether it's a union of the Arabic Maghreb or eco-wars are part of the architecture of peace and security in Africa. It should be the basis of it, and as he explained very well, they are collapsing somehow. Christine,
oui, bonjour. Je voudrais aller dans la même veine. J'aimerais savoir si les trois États, donc AES, CES, retourneront un jour dans la CEDEAO
will
ou si
go
c'est la
back
fin de la
to
CEDEAO.
eco-wars one day, or if it is the end of eco-wars.
Le rêve du
And I would like
Mashrek
to
est un
know
rêve inatteignable,
if the dream of the Mashrek is not possible to reach.
Déjà, le Maghreb, vous
Well,
semblez
the
avoir dit qu'il y
Maghreb,
avait du mal. Je
you
pense que le
seem
Mashrek,
that you have
mais pourquoi pas, parce que
difficulties.
c'est
So
un
what
espace
about
d'échange,
Mashrek? Because it's an
voilà,
exchange,
naturel, pour la géographie,
natural
peut-être moins évident au plan de la
exchange,
politique.
geographical exchange. So maybe not so much political, but geographically. Thank you. A third question?
Une autre série de questions.
Third question before another
Allez-y,
series
monsieur.
of questions.
Parlez bien dans votre micro, s'il vous plaît.
Please talk into the mic.
Voilà, là c'est bon maintenant. Donc je remercie l'ensemble des intervenants, les
All
trois
of
chercheurs
the
qui sont en
speakers,
face de
the
nous.
three researchers
Mais
in
moi
front of
j'avais une
us,
question
but I
autour
have
de
a
la
question
jeunesse
about the
africaine. Parce
youngsters or
qu'aujourd'hui, quand on regarde de
African
très
young
près
people.
l'ensemble des conflits que
Today,
nous
when
avons
we look at
dans
all
notre
the
continent,
conflicts in
sont
Africa,
l'apanage des gens qui sont nés avant
it's
l'indépendance
for people
ou aujourd'hui
who were
qui sont
born
nés un
before
peu
the
plus après
independence or
l'indépendance.
after the
Mais il y a des
independence.
choses qui
But
sont extrêmement
things
importantes qui
are
se
very
déroulent aujourd'hui
important
en Afrique.
in Africa
Notamment, M.
nowadays.
Gushawa l'a dit tout à l'heure
Mr.
en fin
Goshawa mentioned
de
it
conclusion
at the end
sur
in
des
his
pays
conclusion
où
about
l'avancée
countries
démocratique,
where
si
the
on peut l'appeler
democratic
ainsi,
progress, if we
commence
can
à
call
porter
it
des
like
fruits,
this,
notamment
is starting to be
Kenya,
positive and
au
fruitful,
Nigeria,
like in
le Sénégal
Kenya,
tout récemment,
Nigeria,
nous
Senegal.
l'avons vu, et que cette
Recently,
jeunesse consciente commence
you know, these
aujourd'hui
young
à se
people are being
mettre,
aware
devant
nowadays
des
and
sujets de
are
développement et
fighting for
d'émancipation de
development,
la population.
emancipation
Quel
topics
regard
for the
faites-vous
population.
aujourd'hui,
So what is
en
your
dehors de la
opinion
guerre, hein, parce que si on
apart
peut
from
parler
the
de la
war?
guerre,
Of course, we can
RDC
always
Congo,
talk
6
about
millions
the
de morts,
war.
et personne n'en parle. 4
DRC
millions de
Congo,
déplacés.
6 million of
L'autre
people
professeur l'a
died.
dit, sur la corne de l'Afrique.
A few
Plus de
millions
1
of
million de
displaced
morts.
people. Horn
Plus
of
de 400
Africa,
000
more than
déplacés,
1
etc.
million of
Mais
dead
face à
people,
ce tableau sombre de
400,000 people
l'histoire
displaced.
qui est
So
là
in
aujourd'hui, que
this
chacun se
very
rejette la
dark
responsabilité.
background,
Je pense
and
que
everybody
nous
is
n'avons pas
rejecting the
vécu tous ces
responsibility
temps-là.
to the others. We
Actuellement, ce
haven't
qui
known
nous importe,
of
c'est
these
comment notre
periods.
continent peut
So now
sortir
the question is
de cette
how our
situation,
continent
comment nos
can
pays peuvent
get
aller de
out of
l'avant.
this situation. How can we
Et
make
ensuite,
progress
sur
and be
les
developed?
configurations
And
géopolitiques, parce que
concerning
tout ce
the
qu'on dit jusqu'à là,
geographical
les États n'ont que
reconfiguration,
des
what has been
intérêts, ils
said
n'ont
so
aucun
far,
ami.
the states have only
Aucun
interests
ami.
and they don't have any
Que ça,
friends.
c'est valable pour les
And this
Occidentaux,
is
que c'est
valid
valable
for
sur certains
Western
Africains.
countries,
Parce
and it
qu'aujourd'hui,
is
quand
also
on parle
valid
de
for
la CEDEAO,
African countries.
on
When we
rentre dans
call
la
about the
CEDEAO aussi, on a des
eco-wars,
intérêts. On ne rentre pas si ça ne nous arrange
they
pas.
are part of
On est
eco-wars
africain si
because
ça
they are
nous arrange.
interested.
On est maghrébin si
We
ça
are
nous
African
arrange
if
pas.
we're interested, and
Et
we are
cette
not from
économie
Maghreb if
doit
we're
être
not
réglée
interested.
avant tout
And this
sur
economy
les mots,
has
parce
to
que
be
les gens jouent
settled.
énormément
You
sur
know,
les mots.
first of all, and
Combien
people play
d'Africains
with the
sont morts
words.
au Maroc?
How many
Combien
African
d'Africains
people
sont
are
morts en
dead
Tunisie?
in Morocco,
Et si
in
ça ne les
Tunisia?
arrange pas, ces pays se qualifient et se désignent comme des pays
These
maghrébins.
countries are called,
S'il s'agit de
and
tuer
they
les
say they
autres
are
Africains noirs.
Maghreb countries when
Si
it is a
c'est
question
les
of
Occidentaux qui les
killing the
accusent,
black
ils
Africans.
se refusent
And
comme
then
défendre
if
les
they are,
Africains.
and if they are
Dites-nous
accused
quelle est la
by
position réelle.
European countries, they
Merci.
say they are African countries. So what is their real position? Thank you for this very interesting intervention. Before giving the floor to the panelists, I would like to react to what you said. In other words, the trend is as a coming from Western countries, we forget about African conflicts. I disagree with this. I think it's between African people who forget about the wars. What about Sahel and DRC? What is going on in Ethiopia and Sudan? The press, African press, is very indifferent. They don't talk about the other wars in Africa. But articles to complain that we show solidarity with Ukraine. You have a high number of articles about the war in Ukraine, so African people can be interested in other things apart from their own problems. When it gives them the possibility to put forward their victimization, and we have to say it aloud. It's not a question only of outside partners, the problems in Africa. Well, I will answer to the last question about our African brother. There is something I can tell you. How many Africans died in Morocco? As many as Moroccan people. I can tell you there were operations of fighting against immigration that was carried out, and among these operations, dead people, I'm surprised, but people impacted as many African people as Moroccan people. It is not directed, it's not against African people. I have to remind you something.
Est-ce que tout le monde sait de quoi on parle?
Do you all understand what we are talking about? There was an attempt of people who Moroccan and African people then tried to overcome the wall through Ceuta to immigrate, and the American authorities reacted. People were injured, and there was no dead people. I'm telling you, to my African brothers, and as many African people as Moroccan people, number one. Number two, Morocco, the only country in Africa who regularized illegal immigrants. 50,000 people, African people, have been regularized between 2017 and 2018. African people in Morocco. So you mentioned Morocco and Tunisia and not Algeria, and I don't know why. So it's a bit too much. I don't think it's too much. No. You'll have a discussion afterwards. What is important for the audience is to be aware that the debates about migrations are very, very present in Africa also. There is probably reconfiguration also in Africa, reproducing the disruption between the white Africa and the black Africa, like in Tunisia. Tunisia is really epitomizing the politics assumed by the state, not so much in Algeria and Morocco. Operations of regularization. I live in a neighborhood where almost 50% of the people are black African. You have to see this. And the African policy in Morocco is a different policy. So keep in your mind and the debates that you are listening to are really violent debates in Africa, very violent topics, not only in Europe. Okay, between African people also. Could you... Could you answer the question about ECOWAS and the African Union? We didn't mention it. Well, African Union, when you hear this, you believe there is a union. It's 44 countries. You've already have the experience of 27 countries in Europe. Do you really have a union? So what about 54 countries? It's already very difficult. There is an organization of African Union who does its best. They do their best. But a big issue in Africa, bearing in mind all the conflicts, what about the financing? The finances to solve this problem is almost 70% from foreign countries. So how can the African Union could apply their own solutions when they are not financing them? You do know that we have the organization of the African Union when we were talking about the independence area. So now we say African countries are independent, and now we complain about we want that the African Union create development. But still in Africa, we're still having countries living with slogans, talking about independence, freedom of people. So they are really outdated. So the African Union does exist, but there is a lot of things to be done. We have a president from the Rwanda. we need the participation of the different states for the financing. There are many conflicts on which the African Union could make progress, namely in south of Sudan, Somalia. So they're making progress. The African Union is making progress. And when we talk about the standby forces, when you mention the structure of peace, it's still difficult for them to be there because there is terrorism in the Sahel countries. They belong to ECOWAS. And the standby forces have never worked. So we still have problems. AES could go back to ECOWAS. This is a question. I don't think so, because the agenda of this country, they want to make progress. They started with a specific agreement at Okuguma. It was a defense agreement, common defense agreement, because they were threatened by military intervention from Niger by the ECOWAS. And I think their agenda is to get rid of, to be free from ECOWAS. And we do not threaten with sanctions when the sanctions are useless. When ECOWAS threatened to impose sanctions, well, you cannot forbid someone from doing something when you can't forbid them to do it.
Je ne crois pas. Ces pays sont conduits par le Mali.
These countries are led by Mali. Mali is the leadership country. ECOWAS is looking for having them back with a mediation with the president from Senegal. But anyhow, this will not be done within the 4 or 5 next years. Mashrek, there was a question about the Mashrek, Maghreb. It's much more Arabic than African. It's part of the Arabic world. When we talk about Maghreb and Mashrek, it is in relationship with the sun rising, Mashrek, which is what we can call Middle East in the Arabic world, where the sun rises, and Maghreb is where the sun
in the
literature of the international organizations of the Western countries. Now we talk about regions corresponding to Mashrek and Maghreb. It's Middle East and North Africa. Honestly, is it really the right distribution? For these countries in North Africa, if they feel more African or more Arabic countries, that's a question. We can ask the question to Egypt. They are part of Middle East, but they are part of North Africa. So a lot of questions. These are the answers I have. Thank you. Would you like to react again? Do you want to say anything? Yvan?
Alors, je ne sais pas si je peux couvrir tout.
Sur la jeunesse.
About the youngsters, young people. Could you say something about the young people?
Non, effectivement, j'ai donné les exemples du Kenya, du Nigeria.
I gave the examples of Kenya, Nigeria, and Senegal. And we can connect this question about young people in Senegal to the relations between AES and ECOWAS. Recently, what we could observe on the social media, they were between the young Senegalese and the different social media from Sahel. Sahel people were hoping that Sonko and Womai would really have a rapprochement with Sahelian people. But Senegalese people were happy to have elected a leader taking distances from the Western countries by rejecting at the same time the military option. And we could see that there was a real debate, political debate within this sovereign arena. How are we going to choose our leaders?
À élire par des processus démocratiques nos leaders.
So do we want to elect our leaders democratically, or do we want to use the military people? I think this is very healthy reflection. This is part of the Sahelian exceptionalism and the military people who are winning.
Diffusé au sein de la société.
And this is diffused among the society. Thank you. Any other questions?
Madame arrive.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
En fait, moi c'est Abdoulaye.
Well, my name is Abdoulaye.
Je pense que si
and I think
nous sommes là ici, c'est pour la paix.
If we're here, it's for peace.
Salle,
so all of you in this room, they want to understand
quel chemin prend l'Afrique, surtout dans la paix.
What Africa, what path or what way is taking Africa for peace. So when you're talking about the African Union, I think that people in this room, the majority of them, they don't know how the African Union is organized. So I'm going to tell you that the African Union that you are talking about is a sort of a trade union of heads of states. It is managed by a dictator. How can you, it's a dictator at the head of the union, how can you expect something positive from them? So I don't believe, I don't believe in a real change in Africa. As long as
le fond des sujets,
we have to do
il faut laisser l'Afrique décider par elle-même.
To look deeper at the topic. And Africa has to manage by their own without ingerence. And because of this ingerence, Africa cannot develop. The heads of states, we have to say, are just puppets, and everybody knows about this. So how can you expect that you want us to change things with puppets having pressure and they cannot take any decisions by their own? And I think this is not possible, and you have to say that aloud. And I think that all the people here in this room can just bring a stone and contribute individually. How can we give ideas to provide appropriate solutions?
Bonjour. Alors, moi, ma question...
Hello, my question or my comment, rather. Mike.
D'accord. Donc, ce qu'a dit le dernier intervenant par
you
rapport
just said concerning the military people, the last speaker concerning the hammer and the nails, and to answer to what the last person said. My question concerning the future of Africa, one of the scheme, what I can see being repeated all the time is the presence among the heads of state and presidents. I only see men and presidents who have been presidents since I was born, and I am 50-year-old. During all these wars, all these dead people, we can see men in power, military people in power. And I think that in Africa, for a peaceful future for Africa, has to go through, let's say, an acceptance by all these men in power, giving a fairer position to women in the decision-making processes, in the establishing of priorities, and obviously to young people. But over the last 60 years, we've seen men in power, whether military or civil persons, and there is it's a waltz or endless movement of wars and genocides. As long as we have this situation, nothing will be changed. Thank you very much.
Je ne sais. Alors, toute dernière intervention.
The last question. Last question, because after that we'll have a conclusion with the panelists. Last question. Thank you.
Je remercie les panélistes.
I would thank the panelists. I would like to say that to enlighten the situation, obviously,
je ne vais pas répondre, bien sûr.
I'm not going to answer the question. Please hurry up.
C'est une manière de lui faire comprendre qu'en réalité, nous ne sommes pas dans des jugements de valeur.
We are not judging the values. What we should do is to reflect on how the Organization of the African Union, who is in charge of security and peace in Africa, how can they ensure this mission? They are in a process of restructuring the security process with APSA. So obviously, we have to reflect on how can we make them more autonomous at a financial level, talking about the African Union. And I would like to talk about the sanctions, the efficiency of the sanctions. In reality, the African Union and accepted regional local mechanisms, but these local mechanisms have reached their limit. So now the African Union should address again the situation.
Rapidement, oui.
Please let me finish.
Toujours sur le sujet.
Still on this topic, the efficiency of these sanctions has been tested by the OIF with an assessment system and follow-up system.
C'est un mécanisme qui vient d'être
It's a mechanism that was just implemented and producing very satisfactory results through the reintegration of Guinea. Yes, Guinea has been reintegrated, and we found the corpse of an officer on the day after. We must not forget this.
I will let Medani to answer because beyond his knowledge of the Horn of Africa is also a specialist of the African Union. So I would like him to answer very, very shortly.
Well, okay. First, let me make a kind of hot pursuit on what Niagale said. I mean, we blame the West and the like, but we have to ask also, serious questions about we as Africans, what are we doing, in terms of these conflicts and the like. And we see a problem here in the sense that in most of these wars and violence, for instance, the African Union or regional organizations, when something happens in Palestine or in Ukraine, they run up and clap and, take some initiatives. While violence and atrocities are happening in many African countries, they don't.
Exactly.
And even they block it at the UN.
Absolutely.
They block a human rights investigation of an African country in Geneva. African countries, including the African Union. What happens in Ethiopia, in Sudan, the African Union doesn't take any initiative. France comes, or the US and Saudi Arabia come. So my point here is that there is this type of, authoritarian brotherhood in Africa, and most of the so-called African solutions to African problems is being turned into African support to African atrocities and African authoritarianism. So my point here is that, to conclude, maybe we are, wasting a lot of years, many years, for not wasting few hours to ask the right questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Je pense qu'il est temps de conclure. J'aurais aimé qu'on...
I think it's time for us to conclude. I would have liked to go even deeper, but a lot of things I think have been said. Thank you so much for being here. I know we have to let our high school students go because they have to catch a bus back. But thank you very much for being here. Just one last word.
J'avais prononcé un mot que je ne voulais pas dire. J'ai dit orienté, non. Je retire ce mot.
I said the word
il n'a pas cité l'Algérie, c'est tout.
I said that the person who asked a question earlier was biased. I didn't want to say biased, but I just mean that that person didn't quote or mention Algeria. That's all.